Let's talk about how this relates to reading, which is our focus. Let's talk about the difference between
Right,
a genetically driven variation in this signal-to-noise distinction process and the kind of variation you
right,
might get that's because of the quality of the soundscape and the environment that the child's developing in.
right. Well, first of all, I want to say that every child that has a reading impairment does not have an identical genetic fault.
I was talking about, for now, the type of sound distinctions you were referring to that are at the core of all language processing difficulties and which are also the kind of central
Right,
components
right,
out of which the reading later
right,
depends.
right,
Putting the reading issue aside, though, for just a
right,
moment, and just speaking in terms of this sound, pure sound level,
right,
there's a variation in how well children process sounds. There's some of it that's genetic or structural or developmental in its origin, and there's some of it that's a consequence of an impoverished
right,
environment because of the interactions that they're having with their parents and their surroundings and how
right,
those interactions are not bringing them the opportunity to make those kind of distinctions. What is
right.
your sense of that spectrum?
The development of human ability represents a complex interplay, but you could say, between your inherited resources and environmental influences. Your ability absolutely springs out of, you could say, the self-organization of your capacities as a product of your environment, given your inherited resources. And so you can't think of, both of them are absolutely crucial for you could say, we have this broad category that we can call normal development, which has a lot of slack, a lot of latitude in it, right? On the other hand, we have the capacity to get the most out of a brain, you could say, which means that the environment is as rich and positive as possible within reasonable terms, right? And there more can be got out of brains if the environment is rich and positive and has greater possibilities expressed. And so you can't. There's been a sort of religion on one frame that we're sort of stuck with our inherited resources, right? And to some extent, of course, we are. It represents a source of limits to every one of us, every living human creature, in every individual human being. But at the same time, we have a tremendous capacity to modulate the outcomes given our inherited resources as a function of our individual experiences. And one of the complications of that is that there's a very poor understanding of what good is when we say what we need to do for the kid to advance the most in the most positive way, to have the most general positive benefit from it. So we're very confused about exactly what it is that the brain needs to get the most out of it, you could say, to make the best communicating, effective, ultimately the best reader, and so forth. But given that aside, absolutely, environment makes an enormous difference. So, for example, we can take rats, and other scientists have taken rats, and you can, in a wide variety of ways, enrich their environments. So you can train a rat with all kinds of complex sound and music and other things occurring in their life that are important to them. And you can demonstrate that their processing of sound in their brain is much more elaborate, much more powerful, much more detailed processing, much more complicated processing, much more selective. I can raise a rat under conditions in which particular classes of sound that have particular features of complication are really important to the rat. And the brain of that rat will be entirely different than the brain of a rat in which that is not the case. I can raise a rat in which I make the rat an expert in some particular domain of sound. Let's say I make the rat an expert at making fine distinctions about subtle changes in the loudnesses of sound. And I look into the brain of the rat and I see the machinery that relates to representing details of the loudnesses of sounds are beautifully overexpressed, beautifully elaborated in the rat, and so forth. So in all kinds of detailed ways, you can change the outcome as a function of the processing capacities of the brain. It's a function of what the brain does, what its history is, what it's learned about, what its progressions are. Now, in our case, in the human case, the listening experience of the brain is overwhelmingly dominated by language experience. Language is a powerful, incredibly powerful experiential source in the average kid. A Dutch scientist counted the words that his child had heard by the time his child was 9 months of age. And he found the child had been in the presence of probably about 4.5 million words, of which about 500,000 had been spoken to the child. child that actually had 500,000 words directed to him, of which about 50,000 were produced in highly exaggerated form, in parentese, where the parent is talking in baby talk to the baby, so the child maybe can follow the speech a little bit more clearly. That's before the child puts the meaning to the first word. That's massive experiential exposure. Now, you and I know families in which, at that same moment in time, a child may not have been in the presence, except maybe on the television, of 50,000 words. Does that make a difference? Very probably. Very probably makes a difference. And the more the parents are interacting with the child, in a sense, the more that received speech means to the child, probably the greater value it has as a training signal. It will make a difference. Sound experience in a child will make a difference. But the way the processor of the brain will be set up will be largely dominated to specialize for the native language that the child is exposed to, because that sound exposure is so massive and so special in the history of learning in the child.
Yeah, it's so central to everything they're listening for in order to pull themselves into their world.
Absolutely, and it becomes so quickly massively rewarding. I mean, it has this wonderful aspect that it becomes a main source of reward for the child, moment by moment in time in life. And
that ties in with the anthropological evidence that talks about how the evolution of the structure of our throat and jaw and tongue and teeth have kind of been selected for, adapted to the demands of articulating spoken language.
Well, one of the things that happens, of course, is that it's massively exercised. And because it's so massively exercised, of course, it's, in a sense, it's also in every individual life history. It's incredibly refined and specialized for that specific purpose. You're not just receiving, well, by the time you're 9 months of age, you're not talking very much. You're mostly talking in the phonemic and syllabic kind of way, but pretty soon, you know, you're producing speech on a massive schedule. And that's also represents heavy motor exercise and sensory exercise for your face and pharynx and tongue and so forth.
All of which are participating in a somatic feedback bath during the process of differentiation, right, which is part of what makes this purely auditory level significantly different than the subsequent processing involved in literacy.
Absolutely. But of course, when you get into reading, then you enter another great epoch of intense exercise and learning. That ultimately, and what is ultimately a massively practiced skill, almost unprecedented in human history and beyond language. It has almost no precedent.
Almost? What's even close?
Well, language itself, of course, beyond language and beyond aspects of movement behavior, movement control. You know, I could imagine other things you do on a very heavy daily schedule that are pretty substantially perfected. But beyond that, nothing.